Let me see my screen. Okay, so welcome all. This is the first of a series of webinars dedicated to the Oyster interoperability framework that we're developing within the Oyster project. And we are very happy in this webinar that we have here Mark Wilkinson from UPM, who is going to present the FAIRIF, the interoperability framework about the FAIR. And more specifically, his presentation is titled A Unified Framework for Consistently Verifying Research Outputs. Within the next hour, Mark, he's going to present what we have done within the project regarding the FAIRIF. And after the presentation, we're going to have also a Q&A session in order to address your questions. So please feel free during the presentation to add your comments, remarks in the chat so we can address after the discussion. So Mark, the floor is yours and I'm start sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. I am going to switch off my camera for a moment and start sharing. And while I'm setting that up, I want to apologize. So we've had a discussion amongst the OS Trails participants about my lack of aesthetic capabilities. So I'm going to apologize that mine will be the most ugly of all of the presentations because there's not an artistic bone in my body. So tomorrow you'll be much happier with a much more beautiful presentation, but I'll do my best to convey the information that I think you need. So I'm going to start just by going through the agenda of what I'm hoping to present, and that is there's a lot of history behind fair assessment, and I think I want to emphasize some of that history because I think it would be interesting to you to know where all of this came from. And then I'll talk about the components that we've identified that are necessary to make up a fair assessment environment and our progress in harmonizing these things in the OS Trails FAIRIF. I want to talk especially about the roles of registries and services in the FAIRIF because that's a lot of what you will interact with as users. And then how it all fits together with the other two implementation frameworks. So, am I fair? And who wants to know if I'm fair? Well, generally, funders want to know, publishers, institutions, governments sometimes want to know, agencies especially want to know. Your peers, when they come to reuse your data, they want to know. And of course, I want to know. I want to know if I'm doing a good job. And you think to yourself, well, it should be easy enough to check, right? So FAIR was intended for machines, but it also was intended for people so that they could accurately discover and reuse data. And people quite frequently are able to do a pretty good job. And so that gives them this false sense of security that, yes, of course, I know I'm fair because I'm able to reuse my own data. But unfortunately, it's not easy to check, right? We did this experiment. Now, I want you to look at the date here, 2018. We started doing this a long time ago. This is just 2 years after the FAIR principles were published. And we came up with a bunch of exemplar metrics for fairness. This was a self-assembled group of original authors from the FAIR principles. And I just want to point out some of the quotes here. So we invited a variety of resources to participate in a self-evaluation where each metric was represented by one or more questions. So we posed a bunch of questions to the data owners. We were trying to evaluate the legitimacy, clarity, and utility of the metrics. We weren't trying to actually evaluate the resource. And that process made it clear that certain metrics, and in some cases even the principles underlying it, were not well understood. Right? So basically, manual assessment doesn't work. And that doesn't surprise me now, but at the time it kind of did. And so the next year, I created an automated version of the same kind of thing so that we could take out the human factor and just see, well, can machines find and reuse data? And so this is a slightly larger author list because we wanted to get a bigger breadth of understanding of what went involved, what people thought about fair assessments. the steps to do this were that we had to design metrics that don't require any human interpretation. Then we had to design a workflow that would look through the metadata and harvest it so that you could start answering questions about what's in that metadata. And then I did a survey, quite a very broad survey, of all of the different ways that people were actually trying to meet the FAIR principles. So all of the ways that people publish, for example, their license information. And I did a very broad spectrum of different kinds of publications to see what was in practice in the world, and then write a piece of code that executes that particular test, for example, for a license. So now it should be easy to check, right? Unfortunately, not really. And I wanted to spend the next little while explaining why even that doesn't work. So let me start at this point. This is a screenshot. You're not intended to read this, of course. This is a screenshot of the FAIR Assist website that lists every one of these rows is a different FAIR assessment tool. And clearly everyone and their dog has written an assessment tool. And there's approximately 30 independently authored tools as of April of this year. If we zoom in and have a look at a couple of them, you'll see that some of them are still manual, some of them are automated, some of them are a mixture of manual and automated, and they are aimed at different kinds of digital objects. So this one is aimed at organization, this one is aimed at data sets, these ones are aimed more generically. So I want to specify, I want to focus on these two tools, Fuji, which is an automated tool for data sets, and FAIR Evaluator, which is my tool, which is an automated tool for a variety of digital objects. It's much more generic. So when we compare those two, this is going back now in time, this result isn't current, but it does explain part of the problems that we have, right? So this is a catalog record from the Duchenne Parent Project, which is a record that was designed from the get-go to be as fair as possible. In my tool, it passes 20 out of the 22 FAIR tests that are accessible to my tool. In the Fuji tool, which is a very popular tool for running FAIR tests, it passes only 2 out of 24. Now, this is going back in time, and there's been conversations between the authors of these tools that have started to harmonize them, and that's good. But it highlights what the problems are. Remember, there's 30 tools, right? Why are machines coming to such different conclusions? Yeah, it's not the machines, it's the people. Now, do you remember this? This is the famous dress where people couldn't decide what color it was. Different people saw different colors. I don't know what color you're seeing right now. I'm seeing gold and white. But this is the problem, right? And I'll start to go through the kinds of differences that the human authors of these tools had in their perception of what FAIR was. So the question of what is metadata was, in fact, not in complete agreement between the authors of these different assessment tools. When should a link be followed to search for additional metadata? Which link should be followed to search for additional metadata? To what extent must a resource follow a specific standard? Should we expect one standard, or should we accept a lot of different standards? And for which kinds of digital objects? And finally, is it acceptable to mix and match standards? So can I take, for example, DCAT, partial metadata in DCAT, part of my metadata in schema.org, and part of my metadata in Void, for example? Is that acceptable, or should you be following one standard throughout your record? Different authors of different tools came to different conclusions about that, and that's how you end up at the highly divergent scores. So EOSC was concerned about this, and so they set up, now this is back in 2021, the FAIR Metrics and Data Quality Task Force. So I was co-chair with Chris on that, and we had 3 outputs that are specifically related to harmonization around metrics, and in particular around the harvesting of metadata and the publishing of metadata, giving guidance to data publishers about unambiguously fair ways to publish metadata. We're now in phase 2 of that task force, which has started in 2024, led by co-chair Ellie and me. And we are specifically looking at the limitations that we observed in phase one, which is that the FAIR assessment isn't actually testing the digital object itself in many cases. It's testing the repositories, which is very frustrating. We also were interested in data privacy issues and licensing issues, and how provenance is being handled. But we're very interested in phase two about if FAIR in its current implementation is helping people reuse the digital object at all, or if we're still blocked at the level of the repository. So we now look at the problem, right? So can we stop it from getting worse, right? So we know that the tests used and the results given are inconsistent. They're largely not comparable. They're using different, often subjective ways to measure fairness. We're lacking a common trusted set of metrics, and they're reproducible tests. And the tests themselves need more transparency. We don't really know what a test does when it runs its assessment. And so when it gives us a pass or fail, we're left a little bit in the dark about what really happened and why, and what did it expect. Now, the Fuji tool and the evaluator tool, they do a pretty good job of capturing a log, but the log can be quite complicated, especially for non-webby expert users. And so we need more transparency. And in addition, we need governance. The objective is to have FAIR tests that are community specific, so that you're testing not just in the abstract, but what do other people in my community usually do, so that I can be more interoperable within my community. And also you want tests that are specific to different kinds of digital objects. I'll talk about one in a moment, where the expectations for an ontology, the fairness of an ontology, are very, very different from the expectations from a deposit in Zenodo, for example. And so we need a lot of different FAIR tests that are contextually specific, and we want to make sure that they are all at a high level of quality. So we need some governance. And that's where OS Trails comes in. So OS Trails is trying to address all of these things. So we're trying to address the decisions from the EOS task forces, operationalize them, put them into practice, harmonize the FAIR assessment environments through standards, through APIs. We want to design and publish metrics and tests for a wider range of digital objects beyond data, and including domain-specific assessments. So what does your community expect? Provide clarity around the framework. In particular, I'm going to talk today about the components and the terminology. And finally, we want to professionalize the ecosystem through some good governance. So these are the tools that are currently part of OS Trails that are in one way or another involved in either assessment in general or FAIR assessment in particular. I'm going to talk about CAT in a second. We'll talk a little bit about some of these others, but not in much detail. But I do want to highlight CAT because that was the grounding for a lot of the other decisions we made. So CAT, is the Compliance Assessment Toolkit, which comes from the FAIR Core for EOS project. I'll mention it again at the right time in a second. So the approach to harmonization of tools is we need to understand what the functionalities are that go behind a FAIR assessment. What do these tools need to do? Right? We need to understand which of those functionalities are exposed or executed by each tool. And that was interesting. I didn't expect that in fact the tools behave differently because they had different purposes. So it's not just the metrics, it's not just the tests, it's not just the metadata expectations. The tools themselves have different purposes and therefore have different behaviors. And I'll show you that in a second. When we look at two example legacy platforms, to show you how the tools can be quite different from one another. All right, so we did, in close collaboration with the Compliance Assessment Toolkit, FAIR Core for EOS, we did a survey of the behaviors of the tools that we knew about, the assessment tools that we knew about, and what each of them was doing. And we tried to categorize the different components that exist in the FAIR assessment landscape. And we came up with the following components: that there were dimensions. Dimensions are things like the FAIR principles. What are the highest level of expectations? FAIR principle F1, the FAIR principles themselves are a dimension. You could think of the care principles also are a dimension, right? And then you have, I'm going to slip over to the right here, you have benchmarks. Benchmarks are community expectations. How do I expect visual objects in my domain to behave? And so I might say, well, I expect it to have a particular license, which has to be open source. It should have its metadata in a particular schema, and it should be annotated using, let's say in clinical trials, using the human phenotype ontology. Right, so here are the expectations for a FAIR record in my domain, and you'll understand that that benchmark actually has a lot of individual metrics. So I need to have an open source license. I need to have a particular schema. I need to have a particular vocabulary. These are all separate metrics. So metrics are very specific, measurable things, whereas benchmarks are overall objectives, overall expectations from a community that are represented in a bunch of very specific expectations. Every specific expectation is then coded up in a test, and that test can generate a result. That result is then sent to an algorithm that represents the community expectation, and the algorithm says, yes, this meets the expectations, or no, it doesn't, and that is then communicated back to the user. And again, the compliance assessment toolkit was absolutely seminal to this, and it's a really extraordinary piece of work if you need to do any kind of assessment. They have a wide range of vocabularies. It's far beyond what we needed for FAIR. They have many different domains of assessment that they cover in their terminologies and their vocabularies. So thank you very much to them, and we continue to work closely with them. So let me show you two legacy examples. So the FAIR Evaluator, that was the one that you saw the publication on in 2019. The FAIR Evaluator had the concept of metrics and tests and their outputs, but it didn't have the formal concept of a benchmark. So it was able to aggregate tests, but not for any purpose other than the person arbitrarily decided that they wanted to execute test A, B, and C. So it didn't have a purpose behind it. The tests were published independently by anyone. So they weren't published all by me. They were published independently by anyone following a particular set of expectations for how a test should advertise itself. And so those tests could actually be executed independently of the evaluator system itself. They were completely independent. They could be executed standalone. And the scope of the FAIR Evaluator was undefined. So any digital object, on the condition that it had an independently published metadata record, so the metadata and the digital object had to be separate, it was able to evaluate that. Now let's look at another legacy tool called FOOPS, coming from Daniel. So FOOPS actually contains all of these concepts in the component model. So it has benchmarks, metrics, algorithms, tests, assessment outcomes, and so on. However, it's focused on the right side. So the tests in FOOPS cannot be accessed independently. You can only address a test by running its benchmark. So you only have access to the benchmarks, and the benchmarks are exclusively for semantic artifacts. So it's for testing things like ontologies. It doesn't test more generic things like image data deposited in Zenodo. So those are very extreme examples of divergent purposes in FAIR assessment tools, although they're both FAIR assessment tools. So you'll see, as I said, it's not just the metrics, it's not just the tests, it's not just the metadata expectations, it's the tools themselves that are designed to behave differently. And so now that we have this component model, we have a set of axes by which we can compare those 30 different tools, so not just the FOOPS and Evaluator, but all of the tools. And that helps us figure out where the alignment needs to happen to harmonize them. So that's the background of FAIR testing, and I hope that some of you are surprised at how complex it is. I didn't know back in 2018 that it was going to be so hard. But it turns out that it's extraordinarily difficult because of the different expectations and because of the different purposes for FAIR testing and why do you do the test in the first place? So let's look at our progress. So defining expectations and locations. So that sounds like a strange combination. What do I mean? So All of these things have to be described. So I have to describe what is a metric, and I have to describe what is a benchmark, what metrics are included in that benchmark. I have to describe a test, and which metric does that test implement? Which metric does it test, right? Algorithms, so we've done those. We've done benchmarks, metrics, and tests. Algorithms are still a little bit up in the air. We're not quite sure how to describe algorithms yet, but we've done these three for sure. And the conceptual level objects, so the metrics and the benchmarks and the dimensions, they're going to go into a registry called FAIRassist. So they can be discovered. So if I'm from a particular community, I can look up a benchmark, and from there I can go through to the metrics and figure out what dimensions and so on. So at the conceptual level, we're working with FAIRassist, part of FAIRsharing. Then at the implementation level, the tests and the algorithms are going to be in a second registry, which is the OS Trails FAIR data point. And finally, I haven't mentioned yet, but this is a really important one. We've created a shared vocabulary for test results that allows us to either directly, so for example, the new version of the evaluator and the revisions of FOOPs and some of the other tools now are migrating so that they all output in exactly the same way. So I can execute tests from multiple tools and merge the results together effortlessly because they're all using the same vocabulary called the FTR, FAIR Test Resource Vocabulary. They're all using the same vocabulary to express the outputs and the results of a test. So now that was very abstract. I want to show you now in the context of sample pilot. So this has not yet been implemented, but this is what it would look like if it were, we hope. Right? So we're going to look at the FAIRassist registry and the FAIR data point registry and how they play multiple roles in the assessment process. So here we have an overview of the kinds of things that are going to be in the FAIRassist registry. Dimensions like FAIR, sub-dimensions like the FAIR Fs, the FAIR As, and then below that, FAIR principal F1, FAIR principal F2. Even the FAIR principles themselves are sometimes multifaceted, so you can have, again, conceptual level dimensions where you are only interested in the resolvability and not the accessibility, not the idea itself, and so on. At some point, those are no longer abstract. And when they're no longer abstract, when they actually describe something that is measurable, we then call it a metric. And the metrics will be registered for discovery and associated with the dimensions that they are relevant to. In addition, we will have the definition of benchmarks, which are composed of various metrics. So a specific example in the case of PANOSC, there's a variety of things that are expected, including compliance with the PANET terminology. So here's our benchmark saying, here's the set of things that I expect. One of those expectations is the use of the PANET terminology. What is the PANET terminology? The metric has a link out to FAIRsharing, say that is the PANET terminology. That is what the metric is talking about. It's like, okay, that is unambiguous, very clear, very transparent, great. Then we go to another registry, then we go to the test, the implementation of that metric, and we have code that actually checks if the data set has terms from that vocabulary. And so we are able to automatically look up what are the expectations for terminologies, and we can look into the metadata and say, are you in fact using it, yes or no? And oh, there's our test result, pass or fail. So that's one layer of where we're going to be interacting between the tools and the registries to do lookups and confirmations. Then those results are sent to an algorithm. The algorithm says, okay, now I'm going to interpret, because remember, there's multiple metrics. And so it may be much more important that you pass test A and B versus test C. Right? So there is some layer of interpretation, right? So certain types of failure may be more serious than others. And finally, we get an outcome. What is the final judgment? How did you do? Are you within community expectations? Are you close to community expectations? Are you outside of community expectations? And for whenever there's a failure or a lack of adherence, we can again link to, this is the thing that you didn't meet. So here's a link to the expectation and some advice for how to meet it. So that's the big picture of how we imagine the FAIRIF is going to work. Right? So let's just have a quick discussion about the intra-FAIRIF pathways. So this is mostly for people who plan to implement the FAIRIF. This is not so much for people who plan to use it. I will explain why later. This should all be hidden from you. But let's look at what's happening again. I've just walked you through it. I'm going to use it. I'm going to display it again in a much more concise way. You find a benchmark that represents your expectations. That benchmark includes a bunch of metrics. The metrics are looked up in a second registry to find their tests. The tests are executed and the results are aggregated through the FTR vocabulary. And finally, that output is sent to a benchmarking tool. And that's what does the interpretation. So that's the internal pathway for going from a benchmark to an answer that we give you. Now, you will never see that unless you are one of the people who has to implement it. Now, this is where we want to go from here. So what is the future? So at the moment, we have a way to say, okay, you passed 3 of the tests and you failed 0 of the tests. But when OS Trails is complete, we're going to have tools that make a judgment. Is that result good? Is it adequate? Is it bad? Is it whatever? And then give contextual guidance. So we're still working on those components. In particular, we're going to have contextually sensitive, what do other people in my community do to pass this test? So you don't get generic guidance, you get very community-specific guidance. Now, this is going to be more interesting to you because this is what you will see. Where does the FAIRIF fit into the larger scope? Right? So, hypothetical example, we haven't done this yet, but this is how we imagine the FAIRIF is going to be used. That FAIRIF is going to be largely hidden. So you should probably never even know you're using it. It'll be inside of, for example, your data stewardship authoring tool, your data stewardship plan authoring tool. And you will be able to immediately do an automated assessment of individual decisions that you're making as far as their community appropriateness, as far as do they really achieve FAIR and so on. So those tests will be run as you're authoring your tool. As you're authoring your plan. For example, we imagine that will happen, and you will not need to interact directly with the FAIRIF at all. A second hypothetical example is that you could build your data management plan and then run a before test. How good is my plan compared to others in my community? And it would test the different decisions you've made and come up with an evaluation of the adequacy of your plan. But we want to be able to run it again at any point during the execution of that plan to check how am I doing, right? So exactly the same plan. Now I'm 2 years into the project. Click a button and you say, how am I doing at this point? Right? How well am I executing my plan? So we intend to be able to plan. So this is part of the OS Trails motto: plan and track and assess. Plan, track, and assess the execution. And that, again, should be embedded inside of other tools so you don't even see it. Right? It just happens. It's a click. And you get real-time feedback. Note that this before and after, especially the after, requires access to information that's going to be stored in the scientific knowledge graph. So, for example, in OpenAir knowledge graph, right, to get the DOIs for research results and so on. So these assessments are going to be the link between the FAIRIF and the SKGIF. And again, you don't have to see that. It'll be embedded in the tools that you use, for example, the DMP tools. So I've given you fairly rapidly a big picture of what the FAIRIF does and why. how complicated it actually is under the hood and how we're trying to hide that from you. So working collaboratively with the EOSC Fairmetrics Task Force, OS Trails is trying to harmonize the assessment and assistance framework, the FAIRIF, to find the components, the terminologies, and the operations. We then want to implement it in a number of different tools that you already use with the support of a core set of registries and services. We are in the process of creating documentation both for users and for implementers. So for people who need to build community-specific metrics and community-specific benchmarks, we have a separate set of documentation for you. So you can start building, because we can't, right? So the pilots represent different communities and they will need to author their own expectations. So we have documentation for users and we have documentations for implementers. We need to not only, we need to understand ourselves, but we also need you to understand how this scales to a wider community, in particular in the context of good governance, right? We need all of the tests to achieve some level of quality so that they are trusted, so that when someone else runs a test on your repository or your deposit or your data, you have faith that that test is actually adequate and correctly written and executes properly and so on. And we need to achieve comparability then between all of the different tests from all of the different platforms. And again, finally, we want to be the engine that empowers assessment and assistance. But again, we want it to be invisible. If you see that you're using it, we've probably failed. So that's the FAIRIF in a nutshell. Here are some links to the specific tools and specifications that I talked about. These are just a few of them. And so as I showed you in the early slide, we have many different tools who are at different stages of implementing these set of decisions. So I'm just linking to a couple of them here. And I believe that's the end of my part, and I hand over now for questions.
Hi, Tassos, you are unmuted.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Andre. Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. It was like I think a very good, overview of, the background, what was there before, Australia's, the beginning of the Australians and what you have achieved so far. And I will go directly, I will open the floor for discussion and Q&A, for the audience. I see that there are in the chat. Let me check.
Nick is asking available. The slides will be available. Yes.
Yes, of course, the slides will be available after the presentation. So please feel free directly to ask, Mark, whatever, do you think is like.
Tassos, it's okay. Forget it. I'll ask you in private.
Okay.
Sorry.
Any comments, questions from the audience? There is a link. Okay, just Susanna said that there was a link error that we're going to fix. Yes. What are the next steps from Daniel Spichtiger? Daniel is the co-lead of pilots of Voice Trails from the University of Vienna.
Right. So the next steps is we are still putting the final polish on the. So we are defining the APIs that are going to allow the different tools to talk to one another and to the registries. And we've been fairly careful so far to not make enemies of our friends. So me with my tool called Champion and Daniel with his tool called Foops and another tool that's name is just gone for the moment. They have another tool in their group. So those three tools are the early adopters, and they're going through the most chaotic churn. We are trying to avoid bringing all of the tools with us as we go through the process of troubleshooting. But we're getting close to the end, right? And so at some point, we're then going to approach those other tools and say, all right, now we have something that's fairly stable. Let's try to harmonize. let's try to harmonize these expectations in these outputs. So the next step is to finalize these APIs, build up the documentation so that everybody who has to implement the APIs knows exactly what to do. And of course, as these other tools come on board, they will be testing our documentation to make sure that it's adequate and will fix it. The next big step is that we don't know. So there are two. The next big step is we still don't know how to describe algorithms. So how do you describe a judgment? Right. So algorithms are community judgments over benchmarks, and they have to be implemented in the form of a piece of code. Not necessarily. So the cat people would say it doesn't necessarily have to be code, but in many cases it will be code. And so we don't know how to describe that. So that is the big task that's coming up next month with a hackathon, is that we're going to try to nail that down. And then the next biggest problem after that is how do you provide guidance at all? Those discussions are ongoing. There's been a really great survey. I don't think the document is public, but again, the CAT team has been doing a survey of the kinds of issues that are involved in guidance and the types of guidance that are possible. So, from solving failures to incremental improvements, you need to provide guidance at a variety of different levels. And so we're doing those surveys now and considering how do you link a specific output from a specific test to a community-oriented, object-oriented piece of advice. So those are the next two big issues that we need to tackle over the next 2 years.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. I see that Thalasia has a hand raised.
It's Francisca, actually. I sent her my link.
Okay.
There-
Yeah, I can ask a question. Thanks, Mark. In the introductory part of your presentation, you mentioned the need for governance. I think that's also a very challenging thing. But could you say a few things about how that should be organized and which stakeholders should be involved?
That was a part of the output from the EOS task forces that I didn't mention. We do have a white paper about one proposal for governance. There's been response from I believe it was from Fair's Fair, where they responded formally to our governance white paper. I can tell you how I imagine it. I imagine it to be something akin to a very small scale W3C working group. Right? So the governance has to be community specific, right? Because so for example, if we were in the area of clinical trials, I wouldn't know what to do. I cannot write a metric. I cannot write the code. But somebody in clinical trials can say, well, this is the expectation from our community. And I could then go and look up the vocabulary or something like that. So we've identified a variety of different stakeholders who have to be involved in individual decisions. And I imagine that that's going to be a code expert, because you need to make sure the code is executed correctly, right? It actually does what it says it's going to do. You have to make sure that the code is acting fairly. We have a long experience now between Fuji and FOOPS and Fair Evaluator and so on. We have a long experience now with the approaches to metadata harvesting that ensure that you really do collect everything that people have provided for you. And there's some upcoming standards also, especially, for example, RO crates that are giving us much richer quality metadata. We have to adapt to the emergence of those technologies. So you need coders who can evaluate the quality of the code, make sure it's behaving correctly. You need the domain experts. You need the FAIR experts, because one thing that we've tried to avoid is going too far outside of the domain of FAIR. And I'm talking about the FAIR IF only, right? So I am not interested from the perspective of FAIR in the popularity of a particular digital object. The number of times it's been downloaded is not of interest to me from the perspective of FAIR. It might be of interest for example, in the SKGs, where they want to see, how frequently is a particular object being accessed, and does that have any relationship to the metadata that it's presenting? So they might have different kinds of questions like that, but FAIR does not. And so I see a variety of stakeholders which will be temporarily assembled for the purpose of making sure that that metric and that test is done correctly and then dissolved. That's how I envision it. I don't know how scalable that is. We will have to start discussing that in the OS Trails project very soon. But that was one of the visions that we put forward in the white paper from the EOS task force.
Can you include the white paper, the link to the white paper in the chat?
I will
do that?
I will put it into the slide deck unless Susanna might have quick access to it. She could copy paste.
I'm gonna do it. Don't worry, Mark.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you
Thanks a
very
lot.
much.
Okay, thank you. Let's speak. There is another question in the chat from Joy Davidson. Is there a chance to get involved in the pilots outside of the OS Trails project? And that this is also, is addressed to, to Daniel Spicht here, I suppose.
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Tassos, maybe you can answer that better than I can.
This is the reason I asked, the contribution of Daniel.
Yes, sorry, yes, Daniel.
Hi, I mean, I can try to answer it. So as maybe those who are familiar with the projects know, we have the national and thematic pilots, which are then implementing, trying out the results of the technical work packages. And so one option, of course, would be to get in touch with the country that you're in, and to see whether within the national pilot, they also, many of them also have a task to reach out to their national community beyond the pilot. So you could reach out to them and ask them whether that's something you can participate in. And since we all, I think, want to make an impact, I think that would actually be, from my perspective, very welcome. But of course, it depends a little bit on which country you are in. So maybe if you can write with which country you are in, we can look up which organization is the lead of the national pilot, and then we can put you in touch with that one. So that would be my first reaction to the question.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. So, Mark, please.
Can I pick up Ines' question? How much of this is data specific, and how much can be applied to a variety of digital objects? So we have talked about that a lot. And one of the decisions, this is a little bit detailed, but one of the decisions that we made is that metrics should be in some way generic, so that they can be applied to a lot of different digital objects. But the tests should then be tagged with the type of digital object that they are appropriate for. So you can imagine there are, let's say in the biomedical imaging domain, there are data types where all of the metadata is embedded inside of the image. Right? You need a very specific test to extract that. But then you could ask the same question. Does it have a license? Does it have particular vocabularies? So the test for testing a Zenodo deposit versus the test for testing an ontology and the test for testing a DICOM image are different tests, but they all refer potentially to the same metric. And so we know they are very data specific, and we've already started to deal with that exact problem. The next question in the chat, I also wanted to talk about, we are, the DSW development team is in fact in the OS Trails project. We are in daily communication with them. So we know already that we can embed things into the DSW and very likely into other tools. DSW just happens to be the one that we're interacting with the most right now. Again, we're trying not to make enemies of friends. So we're picking just a couple of participants to do the early guinea pig testing. And it doesn't differ. It is tangential to the FIPS. So for the purpose of community-specific guidance, so this is the guidance that we're talking about at the final phase of the project. The guidance is going to come from FIPS, right? Where I say, I have my digital object and I am a part of this community. What does my community do? And we can go to, for example, FIPS. We can look up in fair sharing and so on. But FIPS come in at that point where we're going to be saying, what does your community do? And we'll get that answer there.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And another question from Olaf also. Is there any good technical implementation guides published for data repositories with hands-on examples of how to do signposting expression in different metadata format, etc.?
I'm trying to find that question, sorry. Link to the governance, fair impact response. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mari. Fair, yeah, fair impact response. Sorry, I said fair is fair. Apologies. Are the Australians dealing with guidance and like sorry, I'm not able to find that question in the chat.
Okay, let me paste here.
Thank you. I think the technical implementation guides published for data repositories with hands-on examples of how to do signposting. Oh, sorry, that's a good question. I don't know of a technical implementation guide. What I do have, and I'm ashamed to suggest that anyone use it, I do have a signposting implementation test framework, which only if you're a coder would you ever want to touch. But I can validate a correct implementation of signposting. I do not know of a good implementation guide. Unfortunately, that is a very good idea.
Okay, thank you. So let me check. I don't see any other questions regarding the content of your presentation.
So Wilco has provided a link to the fair signposting spec.
Okay.
Which I think is the best we have as far as an implementation guide. Yes. But for specific digital objects, for specific situations, I think we could do with some more touchy-feely documentation. Okay, sorry, Tassos, please go ahead. And no, we only have 5 minutes to.
Yeah. So I see there are no more questions in the chat. So let me share my screen because I see that there are people asking how they can learn more, Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, give me a minute. Okay, nice. So yes, because there were also some questions around how you can evolve in the process and how you can learn more and to be more to digest better what already Mark presented. That right now the Australis is running open code for Mantis, which will open until May 9th. The main topics of these mentorship programs will be about the 3 pillars of the Australians, which is DMPs, data management planning, scientific knowledge graph, and as you see today, the fair assessment. So the idea is that one of the expertise of Australia's project is going to explain what we are doing and how you can upgrade your skills in the these 3 specific type of services. The duration of the project will be from June 2025 to May 2026. and they're going to be like monthly pair meetings. If I remember correct, and this is what we discussed also with Mark, regarding the part of the fair, someone from UPM will be the mentor, or Mark Wilkinson or Daniel Garillo. Am I correct, Mark?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And so yes, the idea is that we are going to have like a kickoff meeting after that, some regular meetings that will be like an hour and a half, and the format will be one-to-one and group based. And this is addressed, to IT infrastructure managers, research support staff, and further support officers. That, as I mentioned before, they would like to advance more, in the fields of data management planning, scientific knowledge graph, and fair assessment. Here is the link. Of course, we're going to share afterwards with the slides, so you can follow, and check all the information if you would like to register. But please note that, of course, priority we're going to have these Trails pilots, because this is the first that they have to implement what we're delivering. So, we are looking forward to your applications. And the next, so I see there is a problem with the presentation. Okay. And there was also a question about the next webinars. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, presentation is being part of a series of webinars that is dedicated to the Oyster interoperability framework. Tomorrow and on Wednesday, we're going to have them at the same time 2 more webinars. The one will be about the DMPIF, presented by Marek Krzyżanek. And the last one will be about the SKGIF, where Andrea Manozzi is going to explain what we are doing in terms of the scientific knowledge graph. And, to have you also a view of right now, Mark present one part of the one pillar. Then we are going to explore how the different parts of RP architecture are connected together. With this, I would like to thank, first of all, of course, Mark Wilkinson for his presentation. I think it's a very nice presentation. And of course, all the partners that have participated, and have contributed to what we have achieved so far within the project. Of course, I would like to thank you, the audience, for being here, and for the live discussion, and for all the questions. And of course, if you want to learn more about the project, you can follow our links, follow in our social media, and of course, you can subscribe to our newsletter, where you can receive bi-monthly all the updates from this project. Thank you very much for being here.